Hello, and welcome to the Alabama Public Health Training Network. We all know the importance of getting a good night's sleep, yet sleep deprivation continues to be an epidemic across the country. Today, we will learn more about sleep deprivation in teens, the physiology of teen sleep, and how to advocate for improved sleep health in teenagers across the country. Thank you for joining us today for our program, Burning More Than the Midnight Oil, Sleep Deprivation in Teens. If you have a question about anything being discussed today, please call or email during our broadcast. The phone number and email address are on your screen now and will appear again later in the program. Also, the handouts, sign-in sheet, and evaluation are all available online. You will need to register for this program in order to access these materials. Continuing education credits have been approved for nurses and social workers for today's program. In order to receive credit for the training, you must watch the entire program, then complete and return the sign-in sheet and evaluation. While content may continue to be relevant, continuing education credit will only be awarded for 1 year for nurses, expiring on May 31st, 2016, and 2 years for social workers, expiring on May 31st, 2017. Let's meet our faculty presenter. Dr. Mary Halsey Maddox is an assistant professor for the Division of Pulmonary and Sleep Medicine at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Welcome, Dr. Maddox.
Thank you. I am so excited to be here today and to talk about sleep deprivation in teenagers. I think sleep is one of the most important health things we can do for our kids today. As we go through today, we're going to talk about sleep deprivation in teens. Is this really a problem that we should be concerned about as healthcare providers? What's the physiology between teen sleep and about sleep in general? What can we do to help our teens get more sleep? Let's start by talking a little bit about sleep in teens today. When we think about sleep, it's important to know what teenagers need in terms of hours of sleep a night. When we think about this, we asked a group of parents, the 2014 Sleep in America poll asked a group of parents, how much sleep does your child need a night? If you look at these numbers, you can see in the 6 to 11-year-old range, about 70% said, oh, my child needs 9 hours or more of sleep a night. But about 30% thought it was 8 hours or less. With the 12 to 14-year-old age range, you can see that number of parents who thought that their children needed 9 hours or more sleep a night dropped to 42%. And more than 50% of parents of the 12 to 14-year-olds seem to think that their children needed 8 hours or less of sleep. By the time you reach the 15 to 17-year-olds, only about a third of parents felt like their teens needed 9 hours or more of sleep. When we asked the teens, how much sleep are you getting? Right? We asked our teenagers in the Sleep in America poll, how much sleep do you get a night? In the 15 to 17-year-old age range, only 10% got 9 or more hours of sleep a night. And in fact, 56% of teenagers got 7 hours or less a night. The 12 to 14-year-old age group didn't fare a lot better. Only 29% got 9 hours or more a night. 42% reported getting 8 hours a night, and 29% said 7 hours or less. What's amazing to me is that in the 6 to 11-year-old age range, 31% of children got less than 9 hours of sleep a night. But how much sleep do teenagers need? Well, we know from the research done by Mary Carr-Skadden back in around 1980 that for optimal performance, teenagers actually need about 9 hours and 15 minutes of sleep a night. Now, this is a bell curve. The 9 hours and 15 minutes is the top of the bell curve. So just like grades in school, there's always a range. Some children need about 8.5 hours of sleep. Some children need 9.5 hours of sleep. It's a range. But 9 hours and 15 minutes showed optimal performance in the teenagers that they looked at. But does this matter? it's important to ask that question, right? Because a lot of people say, oh, we get 7 hours of sleep a night and we do fine. So the question is, does it really matter? To answer that, we have a video that's going to play. It's from a group called ASAP Science. You can find these on YouTube. But it's a video about sleep deprivation, and we'd like to show it now. And this is in adults.
Tired? We all know the feeling. Irritable, groggy, and exceptionally lazy. Chances are you didn't sleep enough last night, or the past few nights. But what exactly is enough sleep? And more importantly, can you ever catch up on it? While the very function of sleep is still debated by scientists, we do know that it's necessary to function efficiently and productively. After all, we spend 24 years of our lifetime sleeping, it had better be important. Researchers have tested how much is required each night by assigning groups of people to 4, 6, and 8 hours of sleep over extended periods of time. After 14 days, those with 8 hours of sleep exhibited few attention lapses or cognitive issues. However, those with 6 or 4 hours of sleep showed a steady decline. In fact, after only 2 weeks, the 6-hour group showed a similar reaction time to a person with a blood alcohol concentration of 0.1%, which is considered legally drunk. The 4-hour sleepers suffered even more, occasionally falling asleep during their cognitive tests. In both groups, brain function decreased day by day almost linearly with no sign of leveling off. Scientists have dubbed this cumulative effect as sleep debt. So can we recover from it? After a night or two of little sleep, studies show that the body and brain can fully recover with a few nights of good sleep. However, with long-term sleep deprivation on the scale of weeks to months, the recovery of cognitive function is much slower, requiring many more nights of quality sleep. On the timescale of months to years, it's unknown whether brain function can be fully repaired or if it causes permanent damage. Paradoxically, with chronic sleep deprivation, your sleepiness or how tired you feel does eventually level off, meaning that you become less and less aware of your objective impairment over time.
So it's really interesting. This video goes on to talk about how your neurobehavioral deficit increases with sleep deprivation. So the more sleep you lose, the worse you perform. But your awareness of that sleepiness, your subjective sleepiness, it plateaus. So this is why you can say, oh, I've been up 35 hours, but don't worry, I've got this procedure, right? And it's because your awareness of how sleepy you are, it disappears as you get more sleepy. Unfortunately, your ability to perform also decreases as you get sleepier. So I show this to residents and to physicians sometimes, and I say, maybe the resident work hours are good. Luckily, some of our other fields, like nursing, have had hours in place for their workers for a long time. It's important to realize that we cannot expect to safely perform our duties when we've been awake for 24, 30, 48 hours at a time. It's really a big deal. We have to get our sleep. Again, remember, when your neurobehavioral deficit increases, your subjective sleepiness plateaus with sleep deprivation. So, I happen to think that the 80s were one of the greatest decades of all time. If you look at Wikipedia, which is of course the greatest source of all scientific information, what we find is that one of the top 100 commercials of all time was done by the Drug Alliance Corporation. And some of you might remember back in the 80s, there was this, you would see this frying pan and it would say, this is your brain, and then they'd turn the frying pan on and they'd say, this is your brain with drugs, all right? And so if you take that, when you look at sleep, and we say, this is your brain and this is your brain without sleep, I actually want to show some neuroimaging, okay? And if you look, the brain on your left, the brain with sleep, this is a brain that's firing efficiently. The neurons are working appropriately, okay? If you look at the brain on the right, that brain is sleep deprived and it is having to work so hard to accomplish the same task as the brain with sleep, okay? That brain is on overdrive. It is overheating. It is having trouble making those neurons fire appropriately, okay? And we know that. We know this from neuroimaging studies. So look, remember, this is your brain. This is your brain without sleep. Take it that a step farther. Look at the neuroimaging of people who are sleep sufficient and people who are sleep insufficient, and you can tell there's a great big difference. When we think about sleep deprivation in teenagers specifically, I like to think about 5 domains that it affects: health, behavior, safety, academics, and sports. When we think about sleep deprivation in terms of physical health, we know that there is an increased cardiometabolic risk, there are increased rates of obesity, increased purging, fasting, and diet pills, increased in IBS. When we think specifically about the cardiometabolic risk and increased obesity, we know that teens who don't sleep as much spend more time in front of TVs, they spend more time in sedentary behaviors, they make more poor eating decisions. Okay. We also know that our growth hormone is released while we sleep, so sleep is crucial for growth. And if we don't get enough sleep, our risk of seizures increases, our risk of migraines increases. Physical health is a big deal when it comes to sleep. When we think about mental health, we know that sleep-deprived teens are more likely to have depression and anxiety. But more than that, they're more likely to have increased thoughts of suicide and increased suicide attempts. I live in a community where teenagers ages 16 to about 22, 23, when the brain is finishing myelinating, I live in a community where about one child a year in that age range has committed suicide in the last few years. Okay? We know our teens are at risk for suicide. We have to protect their sleep to help with that. They also have decreased impulse control, which we'll talk a little bit about. They also have higher Kessler psychological distress scores. This is a standardized scale of stress over a period of time, and it's based on how much stress you've experienced in the last few weeks, okay? And their scores are higher if they're more sleep deprived. Teenagers also report lower self-esteem when they're sleep deprived. When we think about that impulse control and we think about safety and risk-taking behavior, teens who are sleep deprived steal more, they fight more, okay? They have more trouble sitting still. They also have more thrill-seeking. The DRIVE study, which came out of Australia, looked at drivers ages 17 to 24 and 25, and they've said, let's look at how fast and how risky the drivers are based on how much sleep they're getting. The drivers that slept less, they sought thrills far more. They drove faster, okay? They also had increased incidence of drunk driving. We know that sleep deprivation leads to increased substance abuse. There's some concern now that caffeine may be a gateway drug to other drugs, particularly with early heavy use. I see children in my clinic who come in and they're 12, 13 years old, and they say they can't sleep. And I say, well, tell me why you can't sleep. And they say, well, I don't really want to sleep. And I say, well, why is that? And they say, well, I don't want to miss out. And a couple years ago, I found that if I drank caffeine, I could get up and hang out with my friends. I say, well, tell me more. And a lot of times what they'll say is, well, I drink 5 high caffeinated beverages a day, whether that's soda or some of these energy drinks that you see, they all have lots of caffeine in them. These children are drinking huge amounts of caffeine. And I say, well, how's that working out for you? Well, I used to be an A student, but now I'm a D and F student. I've been kicked out of school for fighting. I used to have A's in conduct, now I've got D's. This is a big deal. And when they say, I like the way caffeine makes me feel, we worry. Are you going to go on to drink more alcohol, be a binge drinker, particularly with that thrill-seeking? Cigarettes, marijuana, it's all a big deal. We think about safety. We know that teens who are sleep-deprived have double the unintentional injury risk. A group in China took a group of kids who were sleep-deprived for 3 months at about 7 hours a night. Those kids had double the unintentional injury risk. So that's double the I'm walking along the street and I fall off the curb and I break my arm risk. At UAB, we have a virtual reality lab. It's got a virtual street, and the children go down there and they're able to participate in studies. When they participate in studies, their speed is measured and they get an avatar. Okay? And they have to make a decision of, is this a good time to cross the street or not? Now, we took a group of those kids and said, one of my partners took a group of those kids and said, all right, how risky are you when you are sleep deprived? And those children ages 8 to 15, 8 to 16, they were almost twice as likely to be hit by a car crossing the street when they were sleep deprived compared to when they were not sleep deprived. Think about that. These are children that have been crossing the street for a long time. I would let a 16-year-old babysitter cross the street with my 5-year-old, but maybe I shouldn't be. Maybe I should be asking how much sleep they're getting first. When we think about motor vehicle crashes, we know that children who are sleep deprived, particularly teens, are more likely to have more crashes than the average kid. They're more likely to have repeated crashes, and they have an increased risk of run-off-the-road crashes. Okay? We know that 1% of all motor vehicle crashes are reported to be related to drowsy driving, but 4% of crashes involving fatality are reported under drowsy driving. Yet drivers under 25 years of age are involved in more than 50% of police-reported fatigue-related crashes each year. And when I think about teenagers, I think about that under 25 age group. From the time they hit puberty to the time they're about 24 or 25, that's really when they're teenagers. When we looked at the National Sleep Foundation poll, we saw that 68% of high school seniors report that they've driven while they're drowsy. 15% do it at least once a week. How many of you want to be on the road with a teenager driving sleepy? These impairments are related to sleep loss, as we saw in the video, are greater or equal to those related to alcohol intoxication. This really hit home with me when I heard a TED Talk on alcohol intoxication, and I found out that a blood alcohol level of 0.1 is 4.5 beers on an empty stomach in a 175-pound man in an hour. I would be on the floor. Okay? And this is how our teenagers are driving around. This is a child named Katie Trentlaw. If you go to drowsydriving.org, you can read her story, okay? Her parents have put her story out there. She's a young lady that she had a scholarship to college. She went to go see some friends play ball or participate in a sporting event 3 hours from home. She acknowledged that she was sleepy but felt like she could make it home safely. She ran off the road and crashed and died 12 miles from home, despite being because she was sleepy, right? Despite thinking she could make it home. So what about Alabama? We're giving this from the state of Alabama, so I wanted to put a little Alabama data in here. We know that 3.4% of people in Alabama report falling asleep driving during the preceding 30 days. Most recent data I could find was from a CDC report in 2010 on this. That doesn't make me very excited that I'm on the road with sleepy drivers every day, because I'm on the road with more than 100 drivers every day. So at least 3 of the drivers I come in contact with every day are sleepy. Think about that. We know that in Alabama there are no laws or license restrictions regarding drowsy driving. As a sleep physician, I don't have to report drowsy driving to the DMV. Not only that, there's no drowsy driving as part of our driver's ed. Now, when I think about that, there's a lot of information in driver's ed about trains, right? But how many times have you gone and parked your car on a train track and waited? And how many times have you driven drowsy? Probably we should advocate for educating our young drivers about the risks of driving drowsy. When we think about academics, there have been several studies that show that decreased sleep duration is associated with lower academic achievement. In the that should say National Sleep Foundation poll, not National Science Foundation poll. I didn't catch that. We know that 28% of teens fall asleep in school at least once a week. 22% report falling asleep during homework. We know that A students report that they sleep 15 minutes more than B students, and they sleep 26 minutes more than C students, and they sleep 36 minutes more than D students. If our children are falling asleep during school, if our children are falling asleep during homework, how can we expect them to learn and be their best? several years ago, about 20 or 25 years ago, Mary Kraskadden also looked at some data in terms, and I have all the references at the end for y'all. At the very end, you can look at the references. But she took some kids and she said, all right, tell me what kind of grades you make compared to what time you go to bed, how long you sleep during the week, how long you oversleep on the weekends. And I took that graph and those numbers and I graphed it, and let's look at it for just a minute. The y-axis, okay, is minutes, all right? The x-axis is grades. And what you can see is that on average, the children who make A's and B's go to bed about an hour earlier than the children who make D's and F's, okay? The children who make A's, and that's the yellow line, the children who make A's and B's, the red line, sleep a little more than 40 minutes longer than the children who make D's and F's. Okay, sleep matters. Bedtime matters. When we think about sports, I'm from Alabama and sports are a big deal here. We know that psychomotor vigilance slows in athletes who are sleep deprived, and we're going to look at some studies for that. We also know that athletes who are sleep deprived have decreased accuracy and decreased consistency in what they do. I tried to capture all our Alabama teams down there. When we look at sleep, we also know that if you increase your sleep time, you increase your consistency, your accuracy, and your psychomotor vigilance. So let's look at some studies. This study took a group of athletes and said, let's look at your reaction time with something called a PVT, a psychomotor vigilance test. And before you're sleepy and after you're sleepy. Okay, and so before they were sleepy, you can see their reaction time was somewhere between 240 and 250 milliseconds. It's a pretty good reaction time, right? Then they sleep deprived, these college athletes, and check their reaction time again, and you can see it increased, it almost doubled, right? Oh, excuse me, not almost doubled. It increased by several milliseconds, right? So it went from about 240 to about 280 milliseconds. That may not seem like a big deal in terms of milliseconds, but if you're driving on the side of the road, that's a big deal. If you're playing basketball and you need to get back down the court or catch a ball, that's a big deal. If you're responding to a serve in tennis, that's a big deal. When we looked at tennis players, they took semi-pro tennis players and said, all right, hit a box on the court. We don't need you to hit it hard. We don't need you to hit it fast. Just hit it, okay? Prior to being sleep deprived, okay, the players were all relatively consistent. They then had 3 days of sleep restriction and got caffeine. This study was trying to show that caffeine would help, but it didn't. Their consistency and their accuracy was cut by 1/3 just from being sleep deprived for 3 days. And this is just hitting a box on a court. It has nothing to do with speed. So imagine if they were trying to hit it hard, how much worse that could have been. When we think about speed again, the Stanford basketball team was allowed 10 hours to sleep. Okay, so instead of having their crazy 2-a-day practices where they were going to bed at midnight and getting up at 6 or 7 for practice, they were allowed a 10-hour sleep opportunity. They were able to change their sprint time on average by 0.7 seconds. That is fast in the world of sprinting. Additionally, they improved their three-pointers and their free throws by about 9%. It was a significant improvement. Just think, if our teens could sleep, they could be even better at sports. But again, remember, how much are our teens sleeping? They're not sleeping enough. So is it a problem? I would argue yes, because our teenagers are not only not sleeping, they are building up this sleep debt that we learned about. And I think it's really crushing them. So let's talk about this a little bit about the science of sleep. Why are they so sleepy? Why are they having trouble sleeping? Can't they just go to bed earlier and get more sleep? Well, we first have to answer the question of why do we need to sleep, okay? And we sleep to remember, we sleep to react, and we sleep to regulate and heal our body. When we think about memories, we know that we form our emotional memory first. Our memories are formed while we sleep, but the emotional memory is formed first, and then the affective tone of the memory is formed. And as you progress through the night of sleep, at the very end of the night is when the actual memory itself is formed. This is why eyewitness accounts, particularly to emotionally charged situations, are not great. Okay? Because if you think about an emotionally charged situation, it's not like you're going to go home and get a terrific night of sleep after you're emotionally charged, right? And we process the emotions first, memory last. This study took a group of adults that volunteered and said, we're going to teach you a motor task, and we're going to see if we can make you do better at your motor task. So if you look at graph A, and that's the first graph on your left with the 2 green lines and the red line, they were taught the motor task at 10 a.m. They were asked to practice it at 10 p.m., and you can see they made a small improvement. And then they were asked to sleep, and they were asked to practice it again at 10 a.m. And you can see they made a dramatic improvement. Okay? The next group was taught the exact same motor task, but not till 10 p.m. at night. And then they were asked to sleep, and you can see their improvement was the same at 10 a.m. the next morning after sleeping. Again, are those 2-a-day practices that our teenagers are doing really helping them? Probably not. The other thing they saw is that as folks progress through their stages of sleep, the ones who had increased into sleep had better performance. You can think about that. In 3 sleep we get when we're sleep deprived, and REM sleep we can also see some rebound of when we're sleep deprived. And when we sleep, we progress through several sleep stages in 1 and 2 and 3 and REM. So if you're sleep deprived, you're probably going to be a little heavier on the in 3 or on the REM as you go into it. And so you look at that and you see the stage 2, the ones who were less sleep deprived over time also probably had better performance. But that's an extrapolation from that. But we also sleep to react. We need emotional control. That impulse control we were talking about, that's all related to sleep deprivation. So what we know is if we have people who are well rested, who get sufficient sleep, when they are shown emotional images in front of their faces, very highly charged emotional negative images, the part of their brain that lights up is the frontal lobe. Now, most of you probably know that the frontal lobe in teens is not perfectly developed quite yet, right? But our frontal lobe controls our behavior. It gives us some executive function. In the folks who are sleep deprived, when they were shown those same negative emotional images, their amygdala lit up. Okay? So what does that mean, right? What that means is their fight or flight response lit up. The way I like to think about this is, if you take a puny, kind of geeky teenager, and he looks over and he sees his girlfriend talking to the captain of the football team or the wrestling team, if he is sleep deprived, he is not going to think, oh, I could be beaten up if I go over and say something, is he? No, this poor little geeky, puny, 100-pound teenager is going to go punch him, and then he's going to be taken out, really. But if he's well rested, if he has had sufficient sleep, he's not going to have the fight or flight response. He's going to have the wisdom to say, oh, I don't like that, but maybe they're talking about homework. Maybe they're talking about something else. Maybe I shouldn't pick a fight with the captain of the football team, right? So we know that the folks who are sleep deprived have a stronger fight or flight response. And that's seen not only in how they behave with impulse control, but also in neuroimaging. Again, neuroimaging has really been very helpful in sleep deprivation. All right? And this is just talking about that study, what we saw. Okay? We want the prefrontal cortex to have a lot of connection with the amygdala, right? So we have that executive function, so we have that emotional control. But if they're sleep deprived, they didn't have that. When we think about regulation, there are numerous studies that demonstrate sleep is necessary to mediate health. Ghrelin and leptin are important for weight gain and satiety. Okay? Interleukins and cytokines are inflammatory markers, and they're important for healing. Insulin and cortisol are part of our endocrine function, They're important for blood sugar and day-to-day life and stress reactions. Cardiovascular function. All right, we know that we require nocturnal dipping of our blood pressure at night that is protective. If we're sleep deprived, we're not going to achieve our nocturnal dipping that's protective. And cell reproduction. We know that cases of cancer are higher in shift workers than those who don't get enough sleep. Okay. When we think about this, there's an animal study that was done that's fantastic, and what it showed is that in very sick animals, the ones that had a robust sleep response had significantly improved morbidity and mortality, meaning they got better and they lived. Animals that were not allowed to have a robust sleep response to their illness had worsening of their illness and death. Okay? References for all of this, again, can be found at the end. When we think about the science of sleep, we say, how does sleep work? Well, sleep requires something called process S and process C. And as you look at this graph, the upper C and the lower C are really no different at all. Okay? It's just to show the interplay between process S and process C. The dotted line is the process S. Process S is your homeostatic process. This is the process that is your drive to sleep. Over the course of the day, we all build up a drive to sleep, okay? That's why you wake up in the mornings and in theory you're rested and not sleepy. And over the course of the day, you get more and more sleepy, okay? Your circadian process keeps you awake and keeps you asleep, okay? It controls your melatonin release and a lot of hormone regulation, all right? And what you can see is that you actually have a bump in your circadian process as your homeostatic process builds over the course of the day. Right? And then your process S, your homeostatic process, it drops off exponentially when we go to sleep. That's why that 15-20 minute power nap can be so effective, because it drops off your drive to sleep. Okay? But if it drops off our drive to sleep, we have to have something to keep us asleep. And that's where process C again kicks in. You have release of melatonin and you stay asleep. Okay? We know that sleep need decreases throughout life. So whether you're an infant, at the bottom of the screen and you need about 16 to 20 hours of sleep, to the toddler at the top who needs about 12 to 14 hours, to the school-age child who probably needs closer to 10 to 12, to the teenager who we talked about ideally gets 9, to an adult who also is a bell curve but probably needs around 8 hours of sleep. The sleep need decreases throughout life, but what we also know is our bodies will only stay awake so long. That's why when the residents in medicine would stay up 36, 37 hours, sometimes they would fall asleep at the wheel driving home. That's why your infant ultimately passes out, right? That's why the toddler is asleep on the dog bed after going to a funeral. It's my child, so I can say that. That's why the teenagers fall asleep in school. Our bodies can only stay awake so long. But what about teen sleep? Is it the same? Well, they still have process S, and teens still have process C. But what we know is in teenagers, process S requires more hours awake to cause sleepiness. And process C, the circadian process, demonstrates a natural delay in melatonin release. When we look specifically at melatonin release, okay, what we see is that between the ages of 10 and 20, melatonin is released later and later in the evening, effectively making all children between the ages of 10 and about 20, 22, night owls. You can see on this slide that between ages of 10 and 20, children become progressively more night owls. That tends to be exacerbated in males compared to females. And then it reverses, okay? Then it reverses. This is why we think about the elderly as being able to go to sleep at the same time as the toddlers a lot of times. We know that this just does not happen in humans, okay? So it happens in humans, but it also happens in rhesus monkeys. It happens in rats. It happens in mice. Okay, so it happens in lots of folks. We also know it doesn't just happen in developed countries. Okay, it happens in countries that don't have electronic light, that aren't exposed to stimuli all night long. It's been shown in about 16 different countries on 6 continents. It's not been shown in Antarctica for obvious reasons. Right? But it's been shown in Iran, in South Africa, in Brazil, in Belgium. It's been shown all over, okay? It's not just the U.S. So one of the key researchers in all of this is a lady by the name of Judy Owens, and she likes to describe teenage sleep as the perfect storm. But what does that mean? What does the perfect storm mean? Well, what it means is the physiology plus the environment of the teenagers causes a circadian misalignment. We all have a circadian clock in us, all of us, and it controls when we go to sleep and when we wake up, okay? It controls when we're sleepy and when we're not. All right, but the teenagers have this shift in physiology, and then they have an environment that is not conducive to sleeping on their internal clock, and that causes a circadian misalignment. If any of you have ever been jet lagged, that is also a circadian misalignment. So, what do we know about teenagers? Well, we know that teens are biologically programmed to go to sleep after 11 p.m. Let me say that again. Teens are biologically programmed to go to sleep after 11 p.m. Guess what time they're biologically programmed to wake up? 8 a.m. Any of you out there who has teenagers? It's kind of tough to wake up your teens in the morning for school. There's a reason for that. Okay? There's a reason. All right? So let's talk a little bit about their environment. First of all, I see that children these days have lots of activities. Whether they're organized or not, they have lots more activities than teens used to when I was coming along, right? So they have school start times that are earlier than they were 30 years ago. They have sports that are more intense than they were 30 years ago with these 2-a-day practices. They have other extracurriculars like drama. Can't tell you how many children I see that have drama practice till midnight, and then they have to get up at 6 a.m. to get to school, and they want to know why they're falling asleep for their test. They have jobs. We know that kids who work more than 20 hours a week get less sleep and take less challenging courses. They have bus schedules. I have a patient with narcolepsy who came in and said, "Dr. Maddox, they're delaying my school start times." And I said, "That's awesome." And he said, "Yeah, but they dropped some buses, so they're picking me up 15, 20 minutes earlier than they used to." All right? Bus schedules are important, okay? They also have social commitments. Obviously, all of our teenagers are social. The other environmental thing I want to spend a little time talking about is electronics and the 24-hour society. We live in a 24-hour society, okay? All of our teenagers now have these cell phones, and they go to bed like this, right? And they put them under their pillow, and they buzz all night long, okay? I didn't have that when I was growing up. When we think about electronics, one of the things we know about electronics is that the light in electronics is called blue light. It is very stimulating to the brain. What it does is when it hits our eyes, it actually tells our body not to produce that melatonin that we need to stay asleep. Okay? So it exacerbates, we think that it further exacerbates the delay in melatonin that teenagers already have. The crazy thing is, a good chunk of kids have no rules related to sleep. All right? So again, when we looked at this, you see, when sleep researchers looked at this, they noticed that 43%, about 40% of 15 to 17-year-olds don't have rules related to video games, computers, tablets, phones, caffeine, which keeps you up, television, and they don't have a bedtime. That's probably not very conducive to encouraging our teens to get more sleep. So looking at the science of sleep regulation, and this slide is courtesy of Judy Owens as well, this again shows that homeostatic sleep drive, all right, and the circadian wake drive. And what it shows is our children are most awake about 8 o'clock at night, 9 o'clock at night. That's when they're most awake. And our teenagers, look when they're most asleep. Look at that. That's what time most of them are getting up for school, 5 to 6 a.m. So what does that do? Well, by the time they actually get to sleep at 11 or a little bit after, they're getting less than 7 hours of sleep a night. So they can make it up on the weekends, right? They can just sleep in and it'll make everything better. Nope, doesn't work. What we know is that we know that discrepancy between weekday and weekend bedtimes and wake-up times are associated with learning deficits and behavior problems. We know that it results in greater trouble sleeping on Sunday night, and it leads to a permanent jet lag. Those of you who have ever been jet lagged, it's miserable. You can get GI problems like diarrhea and just stomach pain and loss of appetite. You can get fatigue and daytime somnolence. You can feel depressed, Okay? So when our teenagers get up at 6 during the week and they sleep till noon or 1 on the weekends, they're flying themselves across 6 to 7 time zones every weekend. Okay? Jet lag symptoms can last 1 day for every time zone crossed. So they only have 5 days to shift back, and then they do it all over again on the weekend. It's really, really hard. But remember, how much do our children need? How much sleep do teenagers need? 9 hours. So their physiology plus their environment leads to circadian misalignment, which ultimately leads to sleep deprivation. So the question becomes, what can we as health professionals do? Okay? And as healthcare professionals, we have the great honor of being able to educate our patients and being able to advocate for our patients. And that really is a privilege that I have learned to appreciate more and more. The first thing is we can educate about the importance of bedtimes. We know that children who do not have parents set bedtimes sleep 30 minutes less a night than kids who have bedtimes. Okay? So just the simple act of setting a bedtime can increase your child's sleep by 30 minutes. Most of the time, parents think they've lost control by the time your children are 14, 15, 16, 17, right? You feel like you've lost control. But the truth is, we know that if you set a bedtime, your child's going to get more sleep. We also know that children who have electronics in their bedrooms sleep 30 minutes less a night than kids who do not have electronics. All right? So think about that. Those two things alone. Set up some rules about electronics, set up some rules about bedtime, and there's a good chance you're going to get your children at least an hour more of sleep a night. Okay? Remember all those kids that didn't have rules. Let's talk about limit setting with our patients. Okay? It's okay for parents to set rules for the 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, and 17-year-olds. And sometimes they need to be reminded of that. Okay? It's also important for us to educate our families. Hey, did you know that it's okay to set rules? Because a lot of our parents don't. When I talk to parents in my clinic, the first thing I always say is, how much sleep do you think your child needs? Usually the response is 7 or 8 hours. Then I respond, and what do you think you can do to help your child sleep? And they say, well, they like their phone too much. They won't give it up. All right? We have to educate and empower our families to limit set with their children. We also need to educate them about what happens when they sleep in on the weekends. Is that important? Absolutely. Right? We need to say, hey, when you let Johnny sleep in for 6, 7 hours on the weekends, it's going to backfire. The grades are going to be worse. The learning problems are going to be worse. Is it okay to sleep in 2 hours? Yes. Absolutely. 6 to 7 hours? Probably not. Right? And talk about the social jet lag that kids get. All of us have seen the teenagers that stay up till 4 or 5 a.m. on Friday and Saturday nights because, quote, I don't have school. And they're doing it playing. They're on Twitter. They're on Facebook. They're on Snapchat. And they're on that other list of things that you're not supposed to do or let your teenagers have, right? They're doing all that, okay? But what is that doing to them during the week? It's causing a jet lag. And we call that a social jet lag. We can also advocate. I think advocating is crucial, all right? When we go into healthcare, whether we're going into it from the social work standpoint or the nursing standpoint or the physician standpoint, we have to speak up for those who can't speak up for themselves or who don't know to speak up for themselves, right? If you go to the Sleep Foundation, there's a whole section on drowsy driving advocacy. You can print off letters and send them to your senator. You can print off letters and send them to your congressman and say, hey, maybe we should have some drowsy driving rules in our state. Okay? But additionally, you can also advocate with your patients. Tell them, do not drive if you're sleepy. Okay? I may not be required by law to report you for being sleepy, but if I find out you're driving sleepy, I probably will report you. Think about that, okay? Let them know there are consequences. And the other thing is, let's educate ourselves about delayed school start times. And we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the American Academy of Pediatrics statement on delayed school start times. So this is the statement. This came out in August of 2014, and it was by the Adolescent Sleep Working Group and Committee on Adolescence and Council on School Health. Now, when the AAP makes a statement, it generally tends to be something that most pediatricians agree on. Like, your child should be in a car seat, right? That's not a very controversial thing for healthcare providers. You should immunize your child. That can be very controversial on Facebook and in the news. But in general, most pediatric healthcare providers are going to support immunizations, all right? So they came out with this statement and said, we think school start times should be different for adolescents. So what did they say? Well, if you haven't seen it, let me give you some of the highlights. First thing they said is that teens in the United States are chronically sleep deprived, that epidemic we were talking about earlier. Yet physiologically, they cannot go to sleep routinely before 11 p.m., and they cannot wake routinely before 8 a.m. Remember the cartoon of the teenager who's up at 2:30 in the morning studying, no problem, saying sleep is for the weak, and her mom can't get her out of bed at 8 to get to school to take her test. Sleep deprivation negatively impacts learning, mood, behavior, safety, and health. We talked about all those things, right? We talked about all those things. It decreases your impulse control, like we talked about, okay? It causes you to feel more depressed, all right? Increased risk of suicide, all right? It affects your learning. Remember, your memory is processed while you're asleep. It's crucial, okay? The other thing they said is that junior high and high schools should not start before 8:30 a.m. Let me say that again. Junior high and high schools should not start before 8:30 a.m. Okay? So what's the evidence? Did the AAP just come up with this and say, hey, everybody, delay school start times because we think it's the right thing to do? No, they actually have evidence in places where they've done it. Okay? This is a really busy slide, and we're going to go to a graph of it in a minute. All right? Kyle Wallstrom did the landmark study of delaying school start times out of Minnesota. And she took a group of 5 schools that were spread out throughout Minnesota. Denver was an area in which they did it. Montana, Wyoming, okay? Took this group of schools and delayed them. The first argument I always hear is teenagers are just going to stay up more. They're going to know they can go to school later, so they're just going to stay up later playing, okay? But what she showed, if you look at just the very second column and the last column, is that when children go to school at 7:30 in the morning, only 1/3 of them sleep more than 8 hours a night, okay? When children go to school at 8:55 in the morning, 2/3 of them sleep 8 hours or more a night. That's a huge difference. Okay? Said graphically, as you delay school start times, children sleep more. Okay? There's another study out of Virginia that I don't have in here where they delayed school start times and the children on average reported going to bed 15 minutes earlier than before. We're not sure exactly why that is, but you have to think it's related to what we talked about before. Children are falling asleep in school and they're falling asleep in doing homework. If they're better rested, they're more efficient, right? We know that delaying school start times improves teens' moods, okay? So these teenagers were asked to fill out depression inventory scores, and they were better, okay? Those who got more than 8 hours of sleep a night had lower scores and were less depressed than those who got less than 8 hours of sleep a night. But interestingly, in this study where they delayed school start times across these 5 school districts, parents were asked, what do you think about it? And they were allowed to freehand write something in. And this is one of my favorite things. They like their teens better. That's a big deal. If you're the parent of a teenager, it's a big deal to like your teen more. Okay? Universally, people liked this. And this was highly statistically significant. So what about academic improvements? Okay? And I think this is important. For some, in this study, what they showed is while the general trend was improved academics if you started school at 7:30 versus if you started school at 8:30, there was sort of this gray area in between, and we don't really know why we didn't see a linear line, but the point of this slide is to look at the trend. Okay? If you start school at 7:30 or before versus if you start school at 8:30 or after, the grades improved. Okay? And that's been shown in other studies more consistently, but I wanted to show this to say that the grades have gone back and forth a little bit, and 8:30 is the time where there has been consistent improvement, which is why 8:30 was the time picked. Okay? So what about car accidents? Okay? There's a group of folks in Kentucky, and they said, man, we have a really bad rate of teen car accidents in our state. Okay? And they looked at 17 and 18-year-olds because they have a graduated license program for their 16-year-olds. And one county alone said, we're going to delay school start times. All right? So they did. They delayed them. They decreased car accidents in 17 and 18-year-olds by 16%. By a lot. Okay? In Minnesota and Wyoming, they were decreased by 65 and 70%, respectively. Wyoming, you would think that they would have the worst decrease, right? Because these kids are driving from a long distance away to get to school. But they changed their school start time from before 7:30 to closer to 9 a.m. They had the biggest change in school start times. But that's huge. Think about that. Think if we could decrease our teens' car accidents by this percentage. So, we're going to conclude with a word from Ben Stein, and we can go back and review and answer lots of questions. But Ben Stein said that sleep makes people calmer, more alert, less fearful, and just plain happier. Or so I see around me and in me. I am sure that if this great nation were to concentrate on getting more sleep, we would be a happier, more confident people, and that by itself would be a major achievement. I have to thank my family, as well as Children's of Alabama and UAB Medicine, the American Academy of Pediatrics. Judy Owens and John Garcia are both diplomats in the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, who were gracious enough to share some of their experience with me and their slides with me. Before we get to questions, I do want to mention some of these references because I think it's important to know. This talk, I'm giving you the evidence that we have that sleep deprivation is a problem. Okay? There are lots of amazing sleep researchers out there, and it's important to know that they're all doing great research. Okay? But when we look at this, we know that when we look through our slides that we've seen today, I want to make sure everybody notices the references. This Journal of Youth Adolescence actually had a great study. It was more of an epidemiologic study, but it was sleep deprivation and safety with risk-taking behavior, and that was more of a, if children sleep this amount, they're more likely to engage in risky behavior, as opposed to decreased sleep causes that. Okay, but I wanted to bring it up because it's really fascinating to look at the correlation of those things. Mary Carskadden's, any of her research is all about the delay that teenagers have, and it's important to look up her stuff to know about that. The International Journal of Obesity has numerous studies that talk about cardiovascular health and obesity relating to sleep. So I do want to refer you all to these references for sure. DrowsyDriving.org, we already mentioned that. That has an abundance of resources to advocate. And you can see the graph that showed minute variability versus grades came from the Journal of Child Development in 1998. I want to point out that if you look through these references, some of these references are really recent, 2014 references. Some of these references go back to 1980. We've known this for a while, okay? And it's really important to recognize that, Okay, so again, when you look at the process S and the process C, there are many journals of physiology that talk about this, all right? But I do want to refer you to that. The Sleep in America poll always has lots of information, and I want to share that with y'all. So those are the references, and I want to make sure that you guys are well prepared to look through them. And with that, you can see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Maddox. That was wonderful. We do have several questions coming in through email. So let me read the first one. Does the research carry over for adults in regard to, quote, technological interference and sleep deprivation? We live in such a 24/7 world of overstimulation.
Yes, it absolutely carries over to adults. So anyone that has difficulty sleeping, we would recommend turning off electronic devices at least a couple hours before your goal time to sleep.
Okay. Our next question is about educating students and parents. The questioner says, this is great information for healthcare providers, but what can you share about educational literature and programs geared for the teen population and your parents? And their parents? Thanks.
Right. So it's really interesting. There's some areas that they're just already doing this, okay? But to get the word out, when we think about this, I did not have sleep education in medical school. I had 1 hour of a CPAP clinic in residency. That was the extent of my sleep education. I didn't know anything about it. And I finished residency in 2008, so not too long ago, okay? I was recently in a meeting and I asked everyone in the room to raise their hand if they had had any sleep education in med school or residency. 3 people raised their hand, okay, out of the entire meeting, and they have all finished in the last 3 years. And so I think the first step is actually to educate healthcare providers, because the first thing a parent or a teen is going to do is say to their doctor or their school nurse or anyone they're seeing at the hospital or in their healthcare setting and say, hey, do you know about this? What do you think about it? Okay? I can tell you that personally, I'm trying to educate my community on this via talks for parents through the school district, okay? Whether it's giving I've also given posters out to pediatricians to put on their doors so that parents can say, hey, tell me a little bit about this, or teenagers can say, hey, tell me a little bit about this. But I think really educating the families is going to have to come from the roots up, right? So it's going to take all of the nurses and the social workers and the physicians and the nurse practitioners who are on the ground interacting with patients and parents every day to start asking the questions and saying, hey, do you know about sleep deprivation? Do you know how much sleep you need? Let's talk about what we can do to make your sleep better. But there are no overall programs that I'm aware of that are set just for parents or students.
Okay. Do we have any questions from the audience members that are here? Okay. I have a question. Okay.
What would be the cost of implementing later school start times for adolescents?
That is such a good question. So there is a lot of perceived cost, okay? It's not always an actual cost, but there's lots of perceived cost. Some areas have actually saved money in doing this. So Denver, for example, has a great public transportation system, and they were able to incorporate public transportation into delaying school start times. Phoenix City in Alabama has done it, and they were able to have it be cost neutral, okay? So they delayed the start times enough that they were able to have it cost neutral with buses and things like that. There's a lot of concern that comes up with, the older children watch the younger children after school, or parents can't get to them, or parents can't get there that late. Phoenix City, for example, in Alabama, was able to work that out by having school drops at school and school pickups at school for those children whose parents were teachers. I've heard that some school districts have been willing to bus the siblings to the older children at their school, and then they all ride home together, which is a really, I think, creative way of handling it. But most people have not found an increased cost. It's been primarily a perceived cost to the school district? This is a great question.
Okay. Go ahead.
Have you seen an increase in the use or the need for the use of CPAPs and that type of technology with younger students where we have a greater problem with obesity, which tends to, I think, increase the likelihood of being able to use that? Is that something you've seen more of in school-aged children?
Yeah, so the question is, are we seeing more sleep apnea requiring the use of CPAP in school-age children? And the answer is yes. We know that between the ages of about 2 and 7, is the peak time for the adenoid and tonsillar growth. Okay, so generally in the younger school-age children, what we see is the need to take out the tonsils and adenoids to treat their sleep apnea. There is now a second peak, so there's now a bimodal distribution of sleep apnea, and the second peak is seen in adolescence. And that is something that we are seeing nationwide, and that's most likely related to the obesity epidemic. So about 3 to 5% of children in the United States have obstructive sleep apnea. Okay? About 10% are primary snorers, meaning they snore but don't necessarily have sleep apnea. But it's really quite fascinating. But yes, we are definitely seeing an increase in CPAP use and sleep apnea in the teens. Certainly, sleep apnea puts you at risk for sleep deprivation. Okay, so if you think about adding that onto the amount of sleep that teens are getting or not getting, right? You just have to think that the sleep apnea epidemic is probably exacerbating the sleep deprivation epidemic. I love to think about that video, for those of you who have seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off, that video where Ben Stein is talking about voodoo economics, right? And he was like, anyone, that right? And you look around the room and everyone is asleep. Okay? They're either asleep with their head drooling or they're looking like this, right? And they're basically, eyes open and asleep. And I think our teenagers are really not any better off today. They really are probably worse off today. And I think probably sleep apnea contributes to that. It's a great question.
We have another question that's come in through the email. This one is titled Examples of Schools that Have Changed Start Times. Can you share any examples and explain how the process worked in making that change?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. These have all been community driven, okay? And so this has never been a top-down decision from a school district, okay? So it's really been community driven. In Denver, like I mentioned before, what they did is they changed their school start times and they gave children the choice, teenagers the choice of you can start at, and I'm making these times up a little bit, but like you could start at 8 a.m. or 9 a.m., right? I don't remember the exact specifics, but they had varied start times. And the option was you could take the school bus, you could take the public transportation, you could get a ride to school, okay? But you picked your school start time based on when you felt you would be most alert. And that was one way in which they handled it. In other communities, I know that in St. Paul in Minnesota, they were actually poised to change school start times to start earlier for sports reasons. And one of the parents happened to be a psychiatrist who's also a sleep doctor. And he got in touch with other parents and started educating the parents on, look, if we start earlier, this is what's going to happen. And what happened by all of the parents getting educated, I think all but a handful of parents then went to the board and said, we don't want to start earlier, we actually want to start later. But it tends to be parent-driven for the most part, which is why it is so important to go back to that earlier question. We've got to educate the parents. It does tend to be, I know that Charleston right now is having a big issue with do they do it or not, and one of the issues with them is that it sounds like what they've tried to do is start their elementary school children much earlier, okay, as opposed to just delaying the school start time for the senior high students. And that's not really the option either. No one wants their 6-year-old starting school at 7 a.m., okay? And that has not gone over well, and now it's caused lots of consternation, and there was a vote on it recently to see what to do. But it tends to be parent-driven.
Okay, we have another question by email. You may have already addressed some of this, Dr. Maddox. It says, when we talk about optimal sleep for teens, what does the research show about sleep patterns that might interfere, such as snoring? Is it recommended that teens participate in sleep studies, such as are becoming popular with adults?
So certainly, if a child is snoring loudly and has any what we call witnessed apnea, meaning you look over and you think your child is having pauses in breathing, gasping, choking, we would recommend a sleep study for sure, okay? I would not recommend a sleep study just based on, oh, my child's having trouble getting to sleep. I would recommend seeing talking to your primary care provider, and if they feel like you need it, to go ahead and refer them to a sleep specialist who can make the decision about a sleep study. But absolutely, if we do sleep studies in teenagers, particularly if we're worried they have problems of pathologic daytime sleepiness, meaning they need medicine to stay awake, so something like narcolepsy. Narcolepsy occurs in about 1 in 2,000 people in the U.S. It occurs in about 1 in 5,000 people in Israel and 1 in 500 people in Japan. So there are definitely ethnic differences, but about 1 in 2,000 people in the U.S. But it's an adolescent disease. So it presents generally between 15 and 15 and 35, but can present as young as infancy. Certainly, if you think your child has a disorder where they require medicine to stay awake, see your pediatrician. They can refer you to a sleep doctor who can decide if a sleep study is appropriate in that case. If you feel like your child has a breathing difficulty at night, talk to your primary care provider. Let them refer you to a sleep doctor who can get a sleep study in them. So yeah, they are indicated at times, but not all the time.
Okay. We don't have any more questions in the email inbox right now, but I think we probably have more questions from the audience. Let's see. Isn't this just a discipline issue with lazy teenagers and parents who can't make their children behave? Is this a real issue?
Right. So this is one of my favorite questions, right? Because and I get this a lot. Right? I have parents come in and they say, my teenager's worthless. You know, he doesn't go to bed at night. He sleeps all day. He's just worthless. And I'd like to go back to a slide, and it'll take me just a second to get there. But I want to talk a little bit about physiology again and show a reminder of the physiology. If you remember, we talked about that teenagers have a physiologic shift in their sleep that causes their melatonin to be released much later in the evening, okay? And that progresses from about puberty until about age 20 to 22. And I'm going to show a picture, which effectively makes teenagers night owls through no fault of their own, okay? So here's that slide. So again, remember, your teenagers produce their melatonin later and later and later in the evening as they get older and older, okay? That's why it's so easy to pull an all-nighter in college, and it is so not easy for me to pull an all-nighter now, okay? We also know they require more hours awake to get sleepy. That's that process S we talked about, okay? So remember, they're night owls physiologically, okay? Can limit setting help? Absolutely. Absolutely. We know, like we talked about, if kids have a parent set bedtime, they get 30 minutes more of sleep, okay? If kids don't have electronics in their room, they get 30 minutes more of sleep. If kids don't sleep in on the weekends, they don't have social jet lag. So can discipline and limit setting play a role? Yes. Is that the only problem? No, they are not just lazy.
Okay. We have another question that's come in through the email. This one's titled Caffeine and Teens. Can you talk about vending machines in school settings and convenience stores which make it easy for teens to access these drinks?
Absolutely, they should be banned. No, I'm just kidding. So, no, we do worry about that because we know that caffeine has a half-life of about 6 to 8 hours. Okay? Caffeine works by being something called an adenosine receptor blocker. Okay? What does that mean? Over the course of the day, we break down our energy. If everybody thinks way far back to biology, you learn about energy being in the form of ATP. As you break down your ATP over the course of the day, you build up adenosine. Okay? As you fill your adenosine receptors, so they're like little pockets, and as you get them full in your brain, like this, what ends up happening is you get sleepier and sleepier. It makes you have more sleep drive. Okay? But caffeine goes in and puts a gate over those pockets. It sews them shut. So the adenosine can't get in, so we can't get sleepy. So caffeine really does not need to be a part of the diet starting about noon on, okay? Because we really want our teens to be able to get to sleep and not stay awake. So yeah, so it's a problem that it is so accessible. I don't really know how to change that short of, but I do think that it's important. I usually say if teens are having trouble getting to sleep at night, limit the caffeine to 1 a day before 12 noon.
Could you give us some examples of where caffeine might be in a teenager's diet that maybe parents don't think of or school systems don't think of as places that caffeine might be hidden in a teenager's
Sure, absolutely.
daily diet?
So, and this will be some... I will have to mention some name brands to do that. So, but things like Mountain Dew, Coke, Dr. Pepper, Pepsi. I don't want to pick on just Coke or Pepsi products, right? But any of those sodas have caffeine. Monster drinks, Red Bull, 5 Hour Energy, that all has caffeine. Excedrin has caffeine. So certain headache medicines actually have caffeine in them. In addition to that, chocolate is a big player of caffeine, okay? So a lot of little kids will come in and see me. I know this is not teenagers, but a lot of little kids drink chocolate milk for dinner, okay? And they drink a lot of it. And so they have trouble getting to sleep. So those are all places where we typically see caffeine. Certainly there are new drugs out there that also can include caffeine, but typically for most teenagers it's in the form of soda and energy drinks.
Okay. More questions from the audience. So we know that when police officers pull someone over for driving, acting like they're woozy or impaired, weaving from side to side, that they can test for alcohol using a breathalyzer test. Is there a way to test someone to see if they're too sleepy to drive or too sleepy to function?
There is. So there's something called a PVT, or a psychomotor vigilance test. And if you'll remember, we talked about athletes being tested for their reaction time. And it's validated for sleep. Okay? We use this a lot. It's validated for sleep. It can come in a handheld device, like a portable computer type device, PDA, that you can tap, okay? And what it is it's reaction time to both visual and auditory stimuli. It also can come in the form of a laptop. It is not used by police officers, okay? They would have to be trained on it, but it is validated for sleep and could be used similar to a breathalyzer. Currently, a lot of states don't even have a place for drowsy driving on their car accident forms. Okay, so Alabama and Missouri, to name a couple, don't have a little checkbox for drowsy driving on their forms. So that's a little bit of a problem, right? Again, this is where advocacy for our patients and our clients comes in. But yeah, it could be used.
Okay.
I have another question. Is there any data on the schools that have already implemented these later start times? Is their attendance better? Are their grades better in these specific school districts?
Yeah, great question. So the question is there any data suggesting that attendance is better, grades are better? What has been shown to be better? Attendance in general seems to improve. Okay. Tardies actually improve, which is great, right? If you think about it, tardies improve significantly. And then the grades, like I said during the talk, For the most part, grades have improved. It tends to be a general trend. There are some schools that haven't shown as much improvement in grades, but for the most part, the trend is grades are better. The other thing is standardized test scores go up. So in several schools, standardized test scores have actually gotten better just by delaying school start times. And you think that you'd have to think that that's because of increased sleep and less sleep deprivation.
Okay. We have a question that's come in through the email. This one says, do you think the FDA should have, quote, health messages on these highly caffeinated beverages? Is there any deliberation at the federal level about this?
So I don't know if there is deliberation about at the federal level. I don't know that. I would love for it to have a warning, right? Caffeine is a legal drug. It can speed up your heart rate, okay? It can dehydrate you, all right? It can keep you awake unsafely, all right? And like we talked about, there's some early evidence that suggests it may be a gateway drug, particularly with early heavy use. I don't like to have a 9, 10, 11-year-old come in drinking 3 or 4 caffeinated beverages a day. That makes me very anxious as to what's going to happen. If you think about it, a lot of them will come in and they want medicine for sleep. And I ask them, well, there's, first of all, nothing FDA approved, but second of all, why do you want medicine for sleep? Well, I can't get to sleep. Well, but you're drinking 4 or 5 caffeine drinks a day. And what I like to tell them is that's kind of what Michael Jackson did. He took medicine to stay up. He took medicine to go down. He took medicine to stay up. He took medicine to sleep, right? So we don't really want our little kids to be on that cycle. Now, I also see toddlers that come in drinking sweet tea in their bottles, and we have to talk a lot about caffeine. That's a big player in my clinic.
Okay. No more email questions at the moment, but I think we do have some more audience questions. How many hours in general can a teenager safely vary their sleep time on the weekends and not have that jet lag you talked about?
That's a terrific question. We generally say about 2 hours, okay? So if their normal wake-up time is 6, we'd like for them to be up by about 8 on the weekends. Sometimes some can do 3 hours, so some can do till 9. But 2 to 3 hours is really the very max that you would want to do it. And usually we say 2 hours, just because once you start crossing more than 2 time zones, if you think about jet lag, it's really, really hard to function after that.
Okay. No more email questions, but we do have a few more audience questions. If we change these school start times, aren't sports and athletic events just going to start later and go later at night, adding to the sleep problem?
Right. So it's interesting, when you look at athletics, most athletics don't actually start before 4 p.m. Okay? Football starts at 7 p.m. Most basketball games don't start till 4 or 5 in the afternoon. Most teams that are coached by parents don't start till after 5 because the parents have to get off work. And most teenager sports also don't start till later. In fact, in my community, my neighbor is in 5th grade and has a basketball game that starts at 9 p.m. Okay? So really, what it does is rather than pushing them back later in the night, it provides them a buffer in the mornings to be able to catch up on your sleep. Because if you have to be at school at 7:30 and you have a basketball game from 9 to 10 at night, by the time you get home and shower and eat dinner and everything, you're in bed by about 11:30. Okay? And you've got to be at school at 7:30 the next morning. Think about how much sleep that gives you. Not enough. And we wonder, I mean, that's why our children are falling asleep in school. They're falling asleep doing homework.
Okay. Another audience question. What's the difference between falling asleep at school due to being sleepy and not getting enough sleep and having a sleep disorder like narcolepsy?
What's the difference? So, in general, a narcolepsy patient is also going to be sleeping after school and at night Okay, a narcolepsy patient or a patient with idiopathic hypersomnia is going to be getting excessive amounts of sleep over the course of a 24-hour period. In general, not always, but in general, a sleep-deprived patient is going to fall asleep early in the morning, in those early morning classes, but have that alertness in the afternoons that's just fine. Okay, so a narcolepsy patient will sleep throughout the day and fall asleep in unexpected places. Most children who are sleep deprived may fall asleep in class or may fall asleep, get sleepy in the car, but they won't necessarily fall asleep talking to you middle of the day, whereas a narcolepsy patient certainly can do that.
Okay. Another audience question.
I noticed earlier that you stated adolescents you're considering up into early 20s. So have colleges looked at this too? Was it delaying start times, or does this affect college students the same way that it affects high school and middle school students?
It's a great question. So the question is that she noticed that I had mentioned that teenagers go up to about age 22, 23, 24, in my mind. Have colleges thought about delaying their school start times? And also, does this affect college students the same way? And I don't know how many colleges have looked at delaying school start times. There was a poster that came out from a college that's a very academically rigorous college recently that said you can sleep, study, and party in college, but you only have time for 2 of these at our school. I'm not going to name the school. Most folks choose study, party. Okay? All right, as in let's give up sleep, right? But it is. We do know that college students tend to get a little more sleep than high school students in general because they have more flexibility in their schedule. But they absolutely drive drowsy, and I know several who have fallen asleep at the wheel driving home from college and been in single car accidents or caused car accidents, and it's really a scary, scary thing.
Okay, another audience question. You mentioned that children and teens who are sleep deprived have more anxiety and more mental health issues. Could you talk about the cause and effect of not sleeping and anxiety? Are children having problems sleeping because they're anxious, or are they anxious because they're sleep deprived?
Right. So both. Okay. So certainly sleep deprivation, again, it impacts that prefrontal cortex, right? They're not able to think through certain things. So they have that high fight or flight response. Their anxiety is ramped up. Okay, they see a shadow and they're not able to process it. It's that emotional reactivity that can trigger anxiety. But at the same time, we also know that children who are anxious have more trouble getting to sleep and more trouble staying asleep over the course of the night. So it goes both ways. Unfortunately, to treat sleep, you have to treat anxiety. And to treat anxiety, you have to sleep more.
Okay. A few more questions. We have about 7 or 8 minutes left, I think. If you are a school nurse and have a child who is chronically tardy and parents are reporting it's a sleep issue, where should they start as a school nurse or attendance officer?
Right. I would actually recommend an evaluation by the primary care physician first. Excuse me. By the primary care physician first, to determine, do we need to send this child to a sleep disorder specialist? There are certainly sleep disorders that can make it very difficult to wake up in the morning. So in addition to the physiologic shift that teenagers have, there's also something called delayed sleep phase. It's a circadian rhythm disorder. We talked about circadian misalignment, okay? But delayed sleep phase is that your body cannot sleep in phase with your schedule. It can't do it. And it's a much more dramatic version of the circadian misalignment seen in teenagers, okay? And these children can't go to sleep till 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, which means they truly cannot wake up in the mornings to go to school. This can cause something called sleep inertia, where you can't get them awake. It can also cause automatic behavior, so you might find that they are automatic driving, they get to school and they don't know how they got there. okay, because they're so sleepy. Or, as happened at my house one time, I said something to my husband about, I asked you that question about while you were ironing, and he said, I didn't iron this morning. But he had gone to bed quite late the night before for work and didn't remember doing it. Okay, that happens, and it's very real. It's very real, and we usually recommend seeing a sleep disorder specialist in that case so that they can reset the internal clock. Okay, so that those children can actually sleep in a schedule that fits society. They'll be great night shift or evening shift workers later on down the road, though. Because it's biologic.
In that case, in the scenario described, should a school nurse have a chat with the parents about behavioral modifications first to assure those limit setting
that would be
things
great.
are not a problem?
And ask the questions about caffeine. How much caffeine are you drinking a day? What time of day are you drinking it? Are you drinking it all at 6 or 7 o'clock at night to try and get through homework? Right? Are you driving when you're this sleepy? That's an important question to ask. Always, always tell your students, do not drive if you're sleepy. Pull over, take a nap, call somebody to come get you, but don't drive if you're sleepy. But yeah, a school nurse, it would be great if you could screen them first and say, tell me when you're going to sleep. How much sleep do you need? Let me share with you how much sleep you really need. Right? So ask those hard questions and give them some answers.
Okay, we have another audience question.
So if a lot of this data has been around since the 80s, as you mentioned, why are we not already implementing these later start times?
Right. So the question is, if a lot of this information has been around since the 80s, why are we not implementing school start times? And I think the first answer is education. Right. So just guessing, I would guess most of the folks who are healthcare providers today, whether it's nurses, social workers, dietitians, whomever, there wasn't a lot of education about sleep in your training. Like I said before, for me, I really didn't have any education for sleep. Okay? It's a relatively young field, but I think the first step is we have to educate people. People are not aware that sleep is a problem. The other thing we hear is, sleep is for the weak. I did this. Yes. I got used to it. Yeah. Right? I can't tell you how many patients I see, and there's a baby that's up all night, and the grandmother says, well, this is a rite of passage. I did it. She has to do it. Okay? Now, that's for toddlers. But you hear the same thing in medical training. Well, I stayed up all night and was on call for 4 nights in a row. Right? That wasn't safe. Okay? So we have to educate people on the consequences of it. I think education comes first and then change. We can't change without people understanding why we're changing.
Okay. We are just about out of time and we have no more questions coming in. Dr. Maddox, do you have a final message for us?
Encourage your teenagers to sleep.
Well, I think that just about says it all. I'd like to thank Dr. Mary Halsey Maddox from the UAB Division of Pediatric Pulmonary and Sleep Medicine for being here with us today, and thank the Alabama Department of Public Health for having her, and thank our audience for tuning in.